Three brothers, experienced electricians, a fun Florida vacation. They were warned twice, once at the front desk, once by a groundskeeper, not to take lights into the cave. They took lights anyway. 3 hours later, a woman stood under a sign that read, "Dangerous caves along the riverbank," waiting for her husband to come back up. He never did. And by the time a rescue diver found all three of them, their lights were still on. This is the Devil's Spring system, and the brothers are just one story. Located in Gilchrist County, just northwest of Gainesville, Florida, is a privately owned nature park called Ginnie Springs. And to understand why it attracts both the best divers in the world and some of the worst accidents, you first have to understand what makes Florida so unique for diving. Florida sits on something called karst topography. Much of the ground is made up of soluble rock, limestone, mostly, and over thousands of years, water sources dissolve that rock from the inside out. What you're left with are massive underground tunnels, sinkholes, and some of the largest cave systems anywhere on Earth. Add in warm weather year-round and water that stays clear in ways that seem almost unnatural, and you have a destination that draws divers from every corner of the globe. Ginnie Springs itself covers 600 acres and attracts hundreds of thousands of visitors every year. It was once owned by a Florida land baron, and when he died, his estate put the land up for sale. A real estate investor came to visit in the late 1970s, fell in love with the property, and then sat on the decision for 3 years before finally buying it. By that time, he had also developed a serious passion for scuba diving. He saw what the land could become, and basically just like that, Ginnie Springs was born. The park has 3 main dive sites. There's the ballroom, a spring shaped like a bowl, 100 feet across and 15 feet deep, with a welded grate at the back to keep divers out of the deeper cave system it connects to. Then there's the Santa Fe River, which runs directly through the property. And the third is the site we're focused on today, the Devil's Spring system. The Devil's Spring system is actually made up of 3 separate springs: Little Devil, Devil's Eye, and Devil's Ear. Regular scuba diving is permitted at the entrance, but only up to a point. Beyond that point, there is a strict rule in place, and it's a clever one: no lights. The thinking is simple. One of the biggest draws of this place is how unbelievably clear the water is. On any given day, you can descend as far as daylight reaches and look up toward the surface to count the leaves on the trees above. In fact, in the 1960s, legendary explorer Jacques Cousteau dove at Ginnie Springs and said they were, and I'm paraphrasing, the clearest waters he had ever seen anywhere in the world. But that daylight only reaches so far. And the no lights policy is there to make sure that anyone who isn't certified in cave diving simply cannot see past a certain point, and therefore has no reason to go there. The problem, of course, is that rules only work when people follow them. Before the current owner even took over the property, at least 28 reported deaths had already occurred inside the Devil's Spring system. Once he took ownership, rules and regulations were put in place, and for 6 years not a single death on the property. Then came August 11, 1986. Sestio and 3, Thehrbrotaris, Gary, Mike, and Dennis were brothers, electricians from Iowa. They had planned a much-needed Florida vacation, and on the itinerary was a stop at Ginnie Springs because they had heard about it and wanted to see what all the fuss was about. None of them had any dive training or certification of any kind. When they stopped at the registration desk, they had to declare this. The desk clerk reviewed their paperwork, noted their uncertified status, and told them specifically about the no lights rule. They agreed to it. Then, as they were gearing up near the water, a groundskeeper came over and struck up a conversation. He asked about their experience. They told him they had virtually none. He warned them again about the no lights rule. They assured him they weren't bringing any flashlights, but they had every intention of bringing lights. They weren't going to visit one of the top cave dive destinations in the world and not see a single cave. So they strapped on their back-mounted air tanks, put their regulators in their mouths, and descended into Devil's Spring. Their plan, as best as anyone could piece together afterward, was to dive into Devil's Eye, make their way through parts of Devil's Ear, and exit into the Santa Fe River. 3 hours passed. Gary's wife, Glenda, stood under that sign, the one that says, "Dangerous caves along the riverbank," and waited. No sign of any of them. She went for help and ran into a man named Wes Skiles. Wes was a dive legend who knew the Devil's Spring system as well as anyone alive. He was also, sadly, no stranger to body recoveries in underwater caves. By 1986, he had brought at least 20 lifeless cave divers back to the surface. But he went in hoping this time would be different. He entered Devil's Ear, swimming against a current that pushes 40 million gallons of water into the Santa Fe River every single day. He couldn't find the brothers on the expected route. He turned into a side passage. What he found was an area so completely silted out that visibility was essentially zero. And just beyond that, Gary alone, already dead. A few feet further, Mike and Dennis, all three were wearing their lights. And every single one of those lights was still on. STE things settled for a while after that. Accidents became rare at Ginnie Springs. Then, around 11 p.m. on May 7, 2001, a man named Steve anchored his boat in the Santa Fe River and suited up alone. Unlike the brothers, Steve was the real deal. He had over 13 years of cave diving experience, hundreds of dives at Ginnie Springs specifically, and he was a certified cave diving instructor. What he loved most was going where no one had gone before, mapping unexplored sections of the cave so that other divers could eventually enjoy them. He had already mapped 4,000 feet of previously uncharted passages. That night, he was going deeper. Now, inside the Devil's Springs system, there is a sign, one of the most infamous signs in all of cave diving. It has an image of the Grim Reaper on it, and the message is essentially turn back or this cave will kill you. For a diver like Steve, that sign was wallpaper. He passed it, fired up his handheld dive propulsion vehicle, and went in. The next morning, when he still hadn't surfaced, his friends went looking. They found his boat, still anchored in the river. They prepared themselves for what they might find, and they went in. On the way, they passed several air tanks that Steve had staged for his return trip, and every single one of them was still full. After an hour of swimming through tight, winding passages, they found Steve about 500 feet inside the cave. He was right next to his guide rope. The tanks on his back were completely empty. 125 feet away, they found his dive propulsion vehicle. Clipped to it was a full bottle of gas, completely untouched. No one knows exactly what happened to Steve that night. Two theories circulate among experienced divers. Either he suffered some kind of sudden physical event, a cardiac issue, a seizure, or he pushed too deep and couldn't fight the current back out before his air ran out. The second theory is hard for most people who knew him to accept. Steve was known for being meticulous and cautious. Taking an unnecessary risk just wasn't in his character. His death remains unexplained to this day. CC Dian 5, Terry A. Jasmax on March 9, 2002, less than a year after Steve's death, a 30-year-old certified caver named Terry arrived at Ginnie Springs with her husband Alan and a friend. She had over 500 log dives. This was a completely routine trip for the three of them. Their plan was to enter at Devil's Ear, reach an area called the Ice Palace, and exit back the same way, using staged tanks for decompression on the return. They followed the rule of thirds, the standard protocol where you plan to use 1/3 of your air going in, 1/3 coming out, and keep 1/3 in reserve for emergencies. Everything was going exactly as planned. About 45 minutes in, they reached the Ice Palace right on schedule. They turned around and started heading back. At around 20:25 p.m., after passing through a tight restriction in the cave called the K-hole, Terry, who was leading the group, suddenly went vertical and turned to face her husband and their friend. She needed to switch to her backup regulator. She reached for Alan, and then her eyes closed, and she went completely limp, losing the regulator from her mouth as she did. Alan immediately pulled his own regulator out and pushed it into Terry's mouth. She didn't respond. They rushed her to the surface. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but Terry never regained consciousness. The investigation revealed what happened. At the depth she was at, around 70 feet, Terry and her dive partners were all breathing the same gas mixture, which contained approximately 38% oxygen. Beyond a certain depth, the standard air we breathe at the surface becomes dangerous. Gas mixtures need to be carefully calculated for each diver because everyone processes oxygen differently. Alan and their friend were breathing the exact same mix and felt nothing. For Terry, that 38% oxygen was enough to trigger oxygen toxicity. Sitio 6, Carlos Antiesh on August 8, 2013, a man named Carlos drove all the way down from Canada to dive at Ginnie Springs. He had his equipment checked at customs, including a standard 80 cubic foot tank marked as oxygen, and was cleared to enter the U.S. Carlos was an experienced and certified cave diver, but by some accounts, he was also known for being overconfident. While he was gearing up at Devil's Eye, one of his friends noticed something on the oxygen tank Carlos was prepping for the dive. The label, OD20, mode stands for maximum operating depth, and the number means the tank should not be used below 20 feet. Since their dive plan that day went far, far deeper than 20 feet, his friend pointed this out. Carlos waved it off. He said he had filled the tank himself before leaving Canada, and the marking was wrong. His friend accepted that and didn't bring it up again. About 400 feet into the cave, at a depth of around 90 feet, Carlos suddenly began seizing. His dive partners got him to the surface as fast as they could. Others nearby rushed over to help pull him out of the water. CPR was performed. He couldn't be revived. After his death, investigators, including 2 experienced cave divers and several members of the Gilchrist County Sheriff's Department, analyzed the contents of that tank. The mixture Carlos had been breathing was 98% oxygen. For context, the dive that killed Terry involved 38% oxygen. Carlos was breathing more than double that at a significantly greater depth. Oxygen toxicity doesn't give you a warning. It doesn't give you time to react. One moment you're diving. The next, you're seizing. CSTO7 ALCOO Hell NIGHTFS ANTY. Not every death at Ginnie Springs involves experienced divers making technical miscalculations. On June 25, 2001, a 22-year-old Christopher was at the spring with friends just having a good time. Around 11 o'clock at night, the group decided to go for a swim. They went in without proper dive suits, just masks and fins, and they brought lights. As uncertified divers, that already violated park rules. After a few dives and returns to the surface, Christopher's friends got tired and got out. Christopher stayed. He went down one more time alone. He never came back up. A rescue diver found him dead at around 35 feet, right at the mouth of the cave. Multiple witnesses told police they had seen Christopher drinking earlier that night. 3 years later, on August 21, 2004, 24-year-old Brian, a math teacher who had just started his second year, was at Ginnie Springs on a weekend trip with friends. Brian was a certified open water diver, but had no cave diving training. Late that night, after multiple dives, he told his friends he had just a few minutes of air left, and he was going to use them on one more descent. He went in alone. When he didn't surface, a Ginnie Springs dive instructor went in and found him dead at the entrance to Devil's Ear, completely out of air. Witnesses said Brian had also been drinking that night. And then there's Isaac. On September 4, 2021, 21-year-old Isaac was celebrating his graduation from an underwater welding certification program. Commercial diving is a specialized, extremely high-risk profession. Isaac had just earned the credentials to enter it, and the people around him were celebrating that. He suited up with air tanks, fins, and a mask, and descended into Devil's Spring with a dive partner. About 15 to 20 minutes in, something went wrong. His partner tried to help but couldn't get things under control and swam up to get help. By the time rescue divers reached Isaac, it was too late. His body was pulled from the water while music was still blaring from the party nearby. His family later filed a wrongful death lawsuit, claiming the commercial diving organization that provided his equipment had allowed him to dive without any cave diving training and had ignored multiple protocols at Ginnie Springs, including not even notifying the registration desk that anyone would be diving that day. An autopsy found no alcohol or drugs in Isaac's system. These are just a handful of the deaths that have occurred at Ginnie Springs and the Devil's Spring system. The exact total number is unknown. The rate of deaths per dive is nearly impossible to calculate. Cave diving is a niche sport with minimal centralized record keeping. What is known is this: before the current owner took over, at least 28 deaths had already occurred inside the cave. And the deaths have continued, involving beginners who ignored the rules and some of the most experienced cave divers in the world. The cave doesn't care how prepared you are. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. If you want to hear the audio version of these stories, you can find the podcast wherever you listen. Story submissions are open. The form is linked in the description. And we'll see you in the next one.